Vampires are the ultimate killing machines. They walk amongst us, and we can rarely tell. Sure, we might notice someone who has unusually pale skin, who we only ever seem to see in the evenings, who's allergic to garlic, and who never seems to have checked their hair in a mirror before they come out. But we don't put the bits together and realise that this must be a vampire. That, or a goth who's an unusually fussy eater. Are they demons, inhabiting the ever-youthful bodies of those whose souls they once devoured? Or are they simply the next stage in evolution, super strong, never ill, always young and beautiful? And do we simply fear them, or secretly long to be like them? Either way, the vampire has rarely had a higher cultural currency. Bram Stoker could hardly have imagined, as he tracked the movements of Count Dracula across the seas, from Transylvania to Whitby, that he would be casting such a long shadow over the world of horror fiction. Since its first publication, Dracula has never gone out of print, and the Count has appeared in more than 200 films. And you would have to be undead not to have noticed the vast proliferation of vampire stories which have characterised this century. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Twilight, Being Human, True Blood, Vampire Diaries. None of them would exist if Bram Stoker hadn't taken a look at Henry Irving one day and thought he looked devilishly handsome, even if he was a bit pasty. But as the new breed of sexy teen vampires lurk on our bookshelves and cinema screens, we should take a moment to remember that vampires weren't always hotties. Dracula might have been dapper, but he was also genuinely scary. He kills a boatload of men single-handedly on his way to England. Only one body is ever found. And Dracula has even come to be feared by other monsters. Vampires and werewolves may have been wrangling for supremacy lately in True Blood and Twilight, but we're never in any real doubt that the vampires will win out. Werewolves usually have no control over their monstrousness, nor any real recollection of it, after the full moon has gone. But vampires aren't just cold, they're calculating too. They have the brains of the human they once were, alongside the physical prowess of the monster they now are. It's a formidable combination. Although Dracula wasn't the immediate publishing phenomenon it would go on to become, Stoker wasn't finished with Das Vampire once his book came out in 1897. Dracula's Guest is a short story written by Stoker and published 2 years after his death.
When we started for our drive, the sun was shining brightly on Munich, and the air was full of the joyousness of early summer. Just as we were about to depart, Herr Delbruck, the maître d'hôtel of the Quatre Saisons where I was staying, came down bareheaded to the carriage and, after wishing me a pleasant drive, said to the coachman, "Remember you are back by nightfall. The sky looks bright, but there's a shiver in the north wind that says there may be a sudden storm. But I am sure you will not be late." Here he smiled and added, "For you know what night it is." Johann answered with an emphatic, "Ja, mein Herr," and, touching his hat, drove off quickly. When we had cleared the town, I said, after signalling him to stop, "Tell me, Johann, what is tonight?" He crossed himself as he answered laconically, "Walpurgisnacht." Then he took out his watch and looked at it, with his eyebrows gathered together and a little impatient shrug of his shoulders. I realised that this was his way of respectfully protesting against the unnecessary delay, and sank back in the carriage, merely motioning him to proceed. He started off rapidly, as if to make up for lost time. Every now and then the horses seemed to throw up their heads and sniff the air suspiciously. On such occasions I often looked round in alarm. The road was pretty bleak, for we were traversing a sort of high windswept plateau. As we drove, I saw a road that looked but little used and which seemed to dip through a little winding valley. It looked so inviting that, even at the risk of offending him, I called Johann to stop and told him I would like to drive down that road. He made all sorts of excuses and frequently crossed himself as he spoke. This somewhat piqued my curiosity, so I asked him various questions. He answered fencingly, and repeatedly looked at his watch in protest. Finally, I said, "Well, Johann, I want to go down this road. I shall not ask you to come unless you like, but tell me, why do you not like to go? That is all I ask." There was just enough of English mixed with the German for me to understand the drift of his talk. He seemed always just about to tell me something, the very idea of which evidently frightened him. but each time he pulled himself up, saying, "Walpurgis Nacht." I tried to argue with him, but it was difficult to argue with a man when I did not know his language. Then the horses became restless and sniffed the air. At this he grew very pale, and, looking around in a frightened way, he suddenly jumped forward, took them by the bridles, and led them on some 20 feet. I followed and asked why he had done this. For an answer he crossed himself, pointed to the spot we had left, indicating a cross, and said, first in German, then in English, "Buried him what killed themselves." I remembered the old custom of burying suicides at crossroads. Ah, I see. A suicide. How interesting. But for the life of me I could not make out why the horses were frightened. Whilst we were talking, we heard a sort of sound between a yelp and a bark. It was far away, but the horses got very restless, and it took Johann all his time to quiet them. He was pale and said, "It sounds like a wolf, but yet there are no wolves here now." Whilst he was petting the horses, dark clouds drifted rapidly across the sky. The sunshine passed away, and a breath of cold wind seemed to drift over us. Johann looked under his lifted hand at the horizon and said, "The storm of snow. He comes before a long time." Then he looked at his watch again, and, holding his reins firmly, he climbed to his box as though the time had come for proceeding on our journey. I felt a little obstinate, and did not at once get into the carriage. "Tell me," I said, "about this place where the road leads." Again he crossed himself and mumbled a prayer before he answered, "It is unholy." "What is unholy?" I inquired. "The village." "Then there is a village?" "No, no. No one lives there hundreds of years." My curiosity was piqued. "But you said there was a village." "There was." "Where is it now?" Whereupon he burst out into a long story, so mixed up that I could not quite understand exactly what he said. Roughly, I gathered that long ago, men had died there and been buried in their graves, but sounds were heard under the clay. And when the graves were opened, men and women were found rosy with life and their mouths red with blood. And so, in haste to save their lives, aye, and their souls, and here he crossed himself, those who were left fled away to other places, where the living lived, and the dead were dead, and not something. He was evidently afraid to speak the last words. As he proceeded with his narration, he grew more and more excited. It seemed as if his imagination had got hold of him, and he ended in a perfect paroxysm of fear, white-faced and looking round him as if expecting that some dreadful presence would manifest itself, there on the open plain. Finally, in an agony of desperation, he cried, "Walpurgis Nacht!" and pointed to the carriage for me to get in. All my English blood rose at this, and standing back, I said, "You are afraid, Johann, you are afraid. Go home, I shall return alone. The walk will do me good. Walpurgis Nacht doesn't concern Englishmen." I turned to go down the crossroad into the valley. With a despairing gesture, Johann turned his horses towards Munich. He went slowly along the road for a while. Then there came over the crest of the hill a man, tall and thin. When he drew near the horses, they began to jump and kick about, then to scream with terror. Johann could not hold them in. They bolted down the road, running away madly. I watched them out of sight, then looked for the stranger, but I found that he too was gone. With a light heart I turned down the side road through the deepening valley to which Johann had objected. There was not the slightest reason that I could see for his objection, and I dare say I tramped for a couple of hours without thinking of time or distance, and certainly without seeing a person or a house. I sat down to rest myself, and began to look around. It struck me that it was considerably colder than it had been at the commencement of my walk. A sort of sighing sound seemed to be around me, with, now and then, high overhead, a sort of muffled roar. Looking upwards, I noticed that great thick clouds were drifting rapidly across the sky from north to south. There were signs of a coming storm in some lofty stratum of the air. I was a little chilly, and thinking that it was the sitting still after the exercise of walking, I resumed my journey. I took little heed of time, and it was only when the deepening twilight forced itself upon me that I began to think of how I should find my way home. The drifting of clouds high overhead was more marked. They were accompanied by a sort of far-away rushing sound, through which seemed to come at intervals that mysterious cry which the driver had said came from a wolf. For a while I hesitated. I had said I would see the deserted village, so on I went, and presently came on a wide stretch of open country, shut in by hills all around. As I looked, there came a cold shiver in the air, and the snow began to fall. I thought of the miles and miles of bleak country I had passed, and then hurried on to seek shelter of the wood in front. Darker and darker grew the sky, and faster and heavier fell the snow, till the earth before and around me was a glistening white carpet. The road was crude, and in a little while I found that I must have strayed from it, for I missed underfoot the hard surface, and my feet sank deeper in the grass and moss. Then the wind grew stronger, and blew with ever-increasing force till I was fain to run before it. The air became icy cold, and in spite of my exercise I began to suffer. The snow was now falling so thickly, and whirling around me in such rapid eddies, that I could hardly keep my eyes open. Every now and then the heavens were torn asunder by vivid lightning, and in the flashes I could see ahead of me a great mass of trees, chiefly yew and cypress, all heavily coated with snow. I was soon amongst the shelter of the trees, and there in comparative silence I could hear the rushing of the wind high overhead. By and by the storm seemed to be passing away. It now only came in fierce puffs or blasts. At such moments the weird sound of the wolf appeared to be echoed by many similar sounds around me. As the snow had ceased to fall, I began to investigate. It appeared to me that amongst so many old foundations as I had passed, there might be still standing a house in which, though in ruins, I could find some sort of shelter for a while. As I skirted the edge of the copse, I found that a low wall encircled it, and following this I presently found an opening. Here the cypresses formed an alley, leading up to a square mass of some kind of building. Just as I caught sight of this, however, the drifting clouds obscured the moon, and I passed up the path in darkness. I stopped, for there was a sudden stillness. Perhaps in sympathy with nature's silence, my heart seemed to cease to beat. But this was only momentarily, for suddenly the moonlight broke through the clouds, showing me that I was in a graveyard, and that the square object before me was a great massive tomb of marble. With the moonlight there came a fierce sigh of the storm, which appeared to resume its course with a long, low howl, as of many dogs or wolves. Impelled by some sort of fascination, I approached the sepulchre to see what it was, and why such a thing stood alone in such a place. I walked around it and read over the Doric door in German, Countess Dolingen of Graz, in Styria sought and found death, 1801. On the top of the tomb, seemingly driven through the solid marble, was a great iron spike or stake. On going to the back I saw, graven in great Russian letters, "The dead travel fast." I began to wish for the first time that I had taken Johann's advice. This was Walpurgis Night. Walpurgis Night was when, according to the belief of millions of people, the devil was abroad, when the graves were opened and the dead came forth and walked, when all evil things of earth and air and water held revel. This very place the driver had specially shunned. This was the depopulated village of centuries ago. This was where the suicide lay, and this was the place where I was alone, unmanned, shivering with cold in a shroud of snow, with a wild storm gathering again upon me. It took all my philosophy, all the religion I had been taught, all my courage, not to collapse in a paroxysm of fright. And now a perfect tornado burst upon me. The ground shook as though thousands of horses thundered across it, and this time the storm bore on its icy wings not snow, but great hailstones. I rushed to the nearest tree, but I was soon fain to leave it and seek the only spot that seemed to afford refuge, the deep Doric doorway of the marble tomb. There, crouching against the massive bronze door, I gained a certain amount of protection from the beating of the hailstones. As I leaned against the door, it moved slightly and opened inwards. The shelter of even a tomb was welcome in that pitiless tempest, and I was about to enter it when there came a flash of forked lightning that lit up the whole expanse of the heavens. In the instant, as I am a living man, I saw, as my eyes turned into the darkness of the tomb, a beautiful woman with rounded cheeks and red lips, seemingly sleeping on a bier. As the thunder broke overhead, I was grasped as by the hand of a giant and hurled out into the storm. The whole thing was so sudden that before I could realize the shock, moral as well as physical, I found the hailstones beating me down. At the same time, I had a strange, dominating feeling that I was not alone. Just then there came another blinding flash, which seemed to strike the iron stake that surmounted the tomb, and to pour through to the earth, blasting and crumbling the marble, as in a burst of flame. The dead woman rose for a moment of agony, while she was lapped in the flame, and her bitter scream of pain was drowned in the thunder crash. The last thing I heard was this mingling of dreadful sound, as again I was seized in the giant grasp and dragged away while the hailstones beat on me, and the air around seemed reverberant with the howling of wolves. For a time I remembered nothing, but slowly my senses returned. My feet seemed positively racked with pain, yet I could not move them. They seemed to be numbed. It was as a nightmare, a physical nightmare, if one may use such an expression, for some heavy weight on my chest made it difficult for me to breathe. This period of semi-lethargy seemed to remain a long time, and as it faded away I must have slept or swooned. A vast stillness enveloped me, as though all the world were asleep or dead, only broken by the low panting as of some animal close to me. I felt a warm rasping at my throat. Then came a consciousness of the awful truth, which chilled me to the heart and sent the blood surging up through my brain. Some great animal was lying on me and now licking my throat. I feared to stir, for some instinct of prudence bade me lie still, but the brute seemed to realize that there was now some change in me, for it raised its head. Through my eyelashes I saw above me the two flaming eyes of a gigantic wolf. Its sharp white teeth gleamed in the gaping red mouth, and I could feel its hot breath, fierce and acrid, upon me. For another spell of time I remembered no more. Then I became conscious of a low growl, followed by a yelp, renewed again and again. Then, seemingly very far away, I heard a "Halloa! Halloa!" as of many voices calling in unison. Cautiously I raised my head and looked in the direction whence the sound came, but the cemetery blocked my view. As the voices drew closer, the wolf yelped faster and louder. I feared to make either sound or motion. Then, all at once, from beyond the trees, there came at a trot a troop of horsemen bearing torches. The wolf rose from my breast and made for the cemetery. I saw one of the horsemen, soldiers by their caps and their long military cloaks, raise his carbine and take aim. A companion knocked up his arm, and I heard the ball whiz over my head. He had evidently taken my body for that of the wolf. Another sighted the animal as it slunk away, and a shot followed. Then, at a gallop, the troop rode forward, some towards me, others following the wolf as it disappeared amongst the snow-clad cypresses. 2 or 3 of the soldiers jumped from their horses and knelt beside me. One of them raised my head and placed his hand over my heart. "Good news, comrades," he cried. "His heart still beats." Then some brandy was poured down my throat. It put vigour into me, and I was able to open my eyes fully and look around. Lights and shadows were moving among the trees, and I heard men call to one another. They drew together, uttering frightened exclamations, and the lights flashed as the others came pouring out of the cemetery pell-mell like men possessed. When the further ones came close to us, those who were around me asked them eagerly, "Well, have you found him?" The reply rang out hurriedly, "No! No! Come away, quick! Quick! This is no place to stay, and on this of all nights!" What was it? Was the question, asked in all manner of keys. The answer came variously and all indefinitely, as though the men were moved by some common impulse to speak, yet were restrained by some common fear from giving their thoughts. It indeed," gibbered one, whose wits had plainly given out for the moment. "A wolf, and yet not a wolf," another put in shudderingly. "No use trying for him without the sacred bullet," a third remarked in a more ordinary manner. "Serve us right for coming out on this night. Truly we have earned our 1,000 marks," were the ejaculations of a fourth. "There was blood on the broken marble," another said after a pause. "The lightning never brought that there. And for him, is he safe? Look at his throat. See, comrades, the wolf has been lying on him and keeping his blood warm." The officer looked at my throat and replied, "He is all right. The skin is not pierced." What does it all mean? We should never have found him but for the yelping of the wolf. "What became of it?" asked the man who was holding up my head, and who seemed the least panic-stricken of the party, for his hands were steady and without tremor. On his sleeve was the chevron of a petty officer. "It went home," answered the man, whose long face was pallid and who actually shook with terror as he glanced around him fearfully. "There are graves enough there in which it may lie. Come, comrades! Come quickly, let us leave this cursed spot." The officer raised me to a sitting posture as he uttered a word of command. Then several men placed me upon a horse. He sprang to the saddle behind me, took me in his arms, gave the word to advance, and, turning our faces away from the cypresses, we rode away in swift military order. As yet my tongue refused its office, and I was perforce silent. I must have fallen asleep, for the next thing I remembered was finding myself standing up, supported by a soldier on each side of me. It was almost broad daylight, and to the north, a red streak of sunlight was reflected like a path of blood over the waste of snow. The officer was telling the men to say nothing of what they had seen, except that they had found an English stranger guarded by a large dog. "Dog? That was no dog," cut in the man who had exhibited such fear. "I think I know a wolf when I see one." The young officer answered calmly, "I said a dog." "Dog," reiterated the other ironically. It was evident that his courage was rising with the sun, and, pointing to me, he said, "Look at his throat. Is that the work of a dog, master?" Instinctively I raised my hand to my throat, and as I touched it I cried out in pain. The men crowded round to look, some stooping down from their saddles. And again there came the calm voice of the young officer. "A dog, as I said. If aught else were said, we should only be laughed at." I was then mounted behind a trooper, and we rode on into the suburbs of Munich. Here we came across a stray carriage into which I was lifted, and it was driven off to the Quatre Saisons, the young officer accompanying me. When we arrived, Herr Delbruck rushed so quickly down the steps to meet me that it was apparent he had been watching within. Taking me by both hands, he solicitously led me in. The officer saluted me and was turning to withdraw when I recognized his purpose and insisted that he should come to my rooms. Over a glass of wine, I warmly thanked him and his brave comrades for saving me. He replied simply that he was more than glad, and that Herr Delbruck had at the first taken steps to make all the searching party pleased, at which ambiguous utterance the maître d'hôtel smiled, while the officer pled duty and withdrew. "But Herr Delbruck," I inquired, "how and why was it that the soldiers searched for me?" He shrugged his shoulders as if in depreciation of his own deed, as he replied, "I was so fortunate as to obtain leave from the commander of the regiment in which I served to ask for volunteers." "But how did you know I was lost?" I asked. "The driver came hither with the remains of his carriage, which had been upset when the horses ran away." "But surely you would not send a search party of soldiers merely on this account?" "Oh, no," he answered. "But even before the coachman arrived, I had this telegram from the boyar, whose guest you are. and he took from his pocket a telegram, which he handed to me. "Be careful of my guest. His safety is most precious to me. Should aught happen to him, or if he be missed, spare nothing to find him and ensure his safety. He is English, and therefore adventurous. There are often dangers from snow and wolves and night. Lose not a moment if you suspect harm to him. I answer your zeal with my fortune. Dracula." As I held the telegram in my hand, the room seemed to whirl around me, and if the attentive maître d'hôtel had not caught me, I think I should have fallen. There was something so strange in all this, something so weird and impossible to imagine, that there grew on me a sense of my being in some way the sport of opposite forces, the mere vague idea of which seemed in a way to paralyse me. I was certainly under some form of mysterious protection. From a distant country had come, in the very nick of time, a message that took me out of the danger of the snow sleep and the jaws of the wolf.
Dan Stevens was reading Dracula's Guest by Bram Stoker. The presenter was Natalie Haynes, and the story was abridged and produced by Gemma Jenkins.
Wherever there is a villain, there must be a hero. And wherever there is a monster, convention dictates there must also be a slayer. Without Beowulf, who would even remember Grendel? Every good story needs a nemesis. And if Van Helsing was the first vampire slayer, then Buffy is surely the greatest. We all knew how to kill vampires before Buffy came along. A wooden stake through the heart, or beheading, or sunlight usually did the job. But Buffy changed our expectations of what a vampire slayer should look like. She wasn't a crusty old man. She was a perky blonde teen who had to fit slaying in around homework assignments and cheerleading tryouts. She might have been young, but she was stronger than any vamp, and wisecracking with it. The vampires of Sunnydale, California had to shape up to fight her, and so the now almost ubiquitous notion of the vampire with martial arts skills was born. In Christine Catherine Rush's story, Hero Dust, we find an homage to the idea of the teenage girl as slayer, the once-in-a-generation figure whom mankind can depend upon to save us from the monsters. And we realise that heroes aren't always who we expect them to be.
Weighed in the balance, hero dust is vile as vulgar clay. Lord Byron, Ode to Napoleon Bonaparte. The weather that summer was frightful. Much later, nearly 200 years later, he learnt that the amazing storms with their torrential downpours and terrifying lightning shows occurred as a meteorological reaction to the eruption of the volcano Tambora in Indonesia. But on those nights in 1816, which he spent listening to the voices echo from the veranda, the weather seemed like some special gift from hell. Bram was not supposed to be there. George Gordon Noel Byron, the 6th Baron Byron, had his doctor, John Polidori, rent the villa so no one would know that the famous poet planned to spend the summer on the shore of Lake Geneva. But Bram wasn't there to see Lord Byron. He had never heard of the man before that May. Bram had come because his mentor had ordered it. His mentor, a man whose name Bram never spoke, not even now, because heroes, Bram had been taught, were not, should not ever be, remembered. The stars say a power will emerge near the summer solstice, his mentor had said. The world shall change at the Villa Diodati. One of us must be there. We must see if we can harness that power and use it for good. Bram had little money and no friends, never before having been outside the city of Amsterdam. But he managed, and he found the Villa Diodati hiding in its gardens when the only renters it would have all year arrived. At that time, Bram could not see how a summer full of poetry and declamation would change the world. Now he cannot imagine the world without that summer, without that change, without the competitive ghost stories and the truths buried therein. Bram sits in the back of the large classroom, his eyes closed. Once he stood in the well at the base of the long flight of stairs, his arms resting on the podium. He had found his best assistants that way, teaching things that could no longer be taught, phrenology and other types of medicine now discredited. The students he'd met there, men who were willing to steal corpses so that they could study anatomy, had the perfect elements to help Bram in his fight to stop the undead. But modern students were not like that, and Bram's qualifications as a teacher had vanished along with the 19th century. He had never thought, when it became clear that he did not age like other men, it is because, his mentor had said to him, you know how to believe in impossible things, that he would outgrow his education, and, in some ways, his usefulness. Abraham Van Helsing, M.D., D.F.H., D.Lit., etc., etc. But he had been forced to drop that name in 1897 after Bram Stoker had published his still famous novel. Stoker lived up to his agreement to conceal all the names involved, all except Van Helsing's, of course, claiming that the world needed to know such an heroic man existed. "How will they find you, man, if they discover a great evil that must be vanquished?" But that was how it had worked from time immemorial. The augurs, combined with science and knowledge, would send someone, once his mentor or his mentor's mentor, and finally Bram, to the right place to do the right thing. This lecture hall is filled with more than 100 students, most of them young, most of them with tattoos and piercings and multicoloured hair. The class is one of 1,000 he has attended at colleges and universities all over America. Each one has a similar title: the hero in literature, the hero's journey, the hero in history. Most are unimaginative, using Joseph Campbell as their base. Still, because of these classes, Bram has learnt of acts of heroism the world over and throughout time, and he has learnt, as the students have learnt, that men are often flawed. But he has not found what he's seeking. There are different types of heroism, and his is a dark form. He needs someone who will steal a corpse to learn how to save a man, not a man who will do everything he can to prevent the corpse from being stolen. So the only thing he can think of is to approach men who study heroism, to see if they've seen that remarkable courage in themselves or in someone else. This small university is his last attempt at this tactic. He has heard through websites and bulletin boards that this place has a star professor, one who seems to understand more than all the others, who can impart that which no other teacher can, what it truly means to be a hero. So Bram is here not to learn, but to observe, and to hope that this time at last he will find his successor. At first, the days in the middle of that June were radiant, sun against a high blue sky, reflecting on the pristine waters of that mountain lake. When he went to Switzerland, Bram had been indentured for 5 years. He was barely 16 years old. Odd that he can remember those years with such clarity. Later years blur, particularly the world wars. They seem like one long war, and he must remind himself that there was a period of silence between, a period in which evil rebuilt itself and started anew. "Our definition of heroism changes," the young professor's voice booms out of the loudspeakers. "After 9/11, we started to recognize the everyday heroism in firefighters, people who risk their lives every time they answer a call. The New York City firefighters became weary of the label after a while. For months afterward, they appeared on television claiming they weren't heroes, they were just regular guys. Bram squirms in his chair. How many times has he heard this variation? Clearly, this young professor is not the man that Bram had heard about. A young woman sitting next to him fiddles with a textbook. She is petite, dark-haired, and as uninterested as he is. Out of the corner of his eye, he thinks he sees the title, Heroism for Dummies. Bram blinks, looks, realizes his mistake. Graduate School for Dummies. He has heroism on the brain. But what are heroes if not regular guys? We elevate the brave among us and assume they lead perfect lives. Then we tear down the pedestal when we realize they're made of the same vulgar clay as the rest of us. Vulgar clay caught Bram's attention. The young professor has not only read Byron, he remembers enough to quote Byron. A shiver runs down Bram's back. Byron. The Byron of his memory is not the Byron who lives through history. The historical Byron is a romantic figure, larger than life, with black hair and beautiful eyes. The man who unwittingly became the model of the modern vampire, tall and suave, a rich man with no soul, who must steal the lives of others in order to live. Byron himself would have laughed at the characterization. What is a writer, after all, he would have said, but a creature who steals the lives of others in order to survive? The Byron Bram observed was a too thin man with a ghastly, pale face. His voice had no beauty to it, too nasal, too harsh. Nonetheless, it compelled. But Byron was the instigator, the man who suggested the gathering tell each other ghost stories every night, the man who saw the world as a competition between himself and everyone else, particularly his friend, Percy Bysshe Shelley. The real Byron had a quick mind, a cutting sense of humour, and an insecurity so vast that it hid itself behind arrogance, for only arrogance could hide Byron's most obvious flaw, his unwieldy club foot, which often forced him to cut adventures short because of the pain it sent along his leg. It was that Byron who told a fragment of a story about a nobleman named Augustus Darvel who contrived to return from the dead. Studies have shown, the professor is saying to an increasingly less attentive class, that heroes are rare precisely because they are heroes. In other words, heroes have an innate disposition to run toward danger when any sensible person would run away. Suddenly he has Bram's attention again. He leans forward in his chair. Most of us fall in the middle. When trouble occurs, we look for help. The lower end of the bell curve are those people who freeze in an emergency, and the upper end are the heroes, the ones who seek out danger. These reactions come from a genetic predisposition and can only be changed slightly. The reactions happen from the subconscious, the animal brain, and not from the conscious mind at all. The animal brain. Bram used to call it the child mind, but later learnt that wasn't exactly accurate. So, the professor is saying, the hero sees danger and rushes to end it with no thought to himself, or herself. Bram leans back in his chair, mulling the words, rush toward danger. He rarely rushed. Usually he walked slowly, knowing he was risking everything. Even that first time he walked into a crypt. Bram was barely 18. He clutched a stake in his right hand and an axe in his left. His mentor behind him with the lantern whose light cast shadows on the crypt wall. Bram's conscious mind told him he was being foolish, that he should run, and quickly, yet his feet did not listen. He walked forward, his heart pounding and his breath coming in quick gasps as he approached the resting place of his very first undead. "You all right?" The young girl sitting next to him touches his arm. "You looked a little grey there for a second." Bram blinks. It takes him a moment to leave the past, a sign that he is getting old. I was just thinking of something else. And his voice sounds rusty, as if he hasn't used it for a long time. The girl laughs. Aren't we all? Her face is narrow, with large eyes and a generous mouth. Her slightness and the intelligence in those eyes remind him of Percy Bysshe Shelley's lover, Mary Godwin. I'm just sitting in, listening, Bram says, hoping for something different. Oh, that would have been last semester, the girl says. Professor Miller is new. The guy who used to teach this class, Professor Addison, he got hired away by Yale. At that moment, the bell rings. The professor finishes his sentence, but no one listens. The girl stands and cradles her books to her chest. Bram starts to stand, slips and falls heavily into his chair. He closes his eyes against the pane. He is useless and has not found someone to replace him. He has managed over the years to get the information out, to use fiction to explain how to destroy vampires. But he cannot get people to believe such creatures actually exist. To believe in them enough to fight them anyway. Are you all right? The girl asks again. He forces his eyes open, then makes himself smile. I'm fine. Her concern touches him. He slides out of the row of chairs, waits, and offers her a hand to help her onto the steps. She looks at him as if he has made an alien gesture, then she smiles and places her hand in his own. She is perhaps 18, barely at the beginning of her life, and he has lived 200 years more than her. He wonders if she would believe that, if her soon-to-be college-educated mind will allow her to take in the fantastic as well as the scientific. She slips her hand out of his, but remains beside him on the stairs. "Are you sure you're all right?" she asks. "You seem upset or something." "I am not finding what I'm looking for," he says, "and I am getting weary." She tilts her head to one side. "What are you looking for?" His back straightens. He has waited almost a decade to hear that question, and now he hears it from the mouth of a young girl, a girl whom, like all the rest of the fair sex, he is sworn to protect. He knows it is the birth of the vampire story, which was the seminal event of that soggy June 2 centuries ago that changed the world, but Byron's fragment, as he later called it, was unremarkable. Bram might have forgotten that story altogether if he hadn't been so stunned at Byron's knowledge of the undead, knowledge that John Polidori expanded upon in his novella, the one which introduced a vampire named Lord Riven. He was so clearly Lord Byron that no one seemed to notice the fictional vampire was the first to reveal what factual vampires were actually like. No, what Bram remembers of that June is Mary Godwin, who sat across from her soon-to-be husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley. "Your tales of ghouls and goblins," she said, "and that horrid discussion about discovering the principles of life have given me nightmares." Her voice gained strength as she began to turn her nightmare into a story, not of ghosts, but of a thing that seemed alive and was not. As she spoke, her face had a paleness to it, the wide eyes, her uplifted chin revealing the naked throat. He had thought, as he watched her in the candlelight, that she, more than anyone else, would be the vampire's desired mate. "May I buy you a coffee?" he asks the young girl, knowing her generation's predilection for the sweetened, creamed, and overly strong drink. It reminds him of Vienna before the war, the First World War, a city that was then filled with coffee drinkers who liked to talk too much about nothing important, and later a city that became the home of so very many undead. The girl gives him half a smile, and he knows she will say no. Why should she say yes? People that young have no interest in the old. "Oh, what the hell," she says. "A double tall sounds good." He gives her a slight bow, which makes her laugh, and then follows her up the stairs. She won't let him carry her books or her laptop, saying she is used to the weight. He is astonished still at the independence and the strength of these young women. He knows that the culture has given them permission to be so. He also knows that they no longer have a real imperative to be feminine, have children, and raise a family. But he finds this new breed of female unfathomable, and this girl is no different from the others. Her tight blue jeans are too short at the hips, and her shirt is cropped too high, revealing her stomach. Bram looks away. This new openness embarrasses him. He cannot change 150 years of training as quickly as he would like. The coffee shop is part of the student union. The girl orders her double tall, and he orders a simple espresso, hoping that the barista behind the counter makes it correctly. The girl leads Bram to one of the tall round tables. "You finishing up your degree?" she asks. "No," he smiles. "I have too many useless degrees as it is." She says, "And sometimes a person turns into a perpetual student, staying in college because it's safe, not because she has a game plan." She extends her hand. "I'm Clarissa, by the way." The good old-fashioned name surprises him. He takes the hand, holds it as if he is going to kiss it, then releases it. Bram. I never met anyone called Bram before. She leans back in her chair. "If you're not taking classes, what are you doing here?" That question again, framed differently, but with the same meaning. He surprises himself when he says, "I am searching for someone with an open mind." He finally spoke to her 7 years later in London. Mary Shelley, by then a widow and the acknowledged author of her novel Frankenstein, or Modern Prometheus, attended the first play made from her work. Bram was free then, no longer indentured. He was in London on other business and went to the play out of curiosity, not realizing she was going to be there. Instead of watching the play, he watched her, an old habit that came back easily. She sat with a small smile on her face, wincing only once when the assistant shouted, "It lives, it lives," a line too overwrought to be in her finely tuned novel. After the show, people surrounded her, asked her opinion. "I was much amused," she would say over and over again. Finally, the crowd departed, and she turned to her companions, asking one of them to hail a hansom cab. At that moment, Bram stepped before her, bowed at the waist, and introduced himself as a student and fan of her work. "I was in Lake Geneva when you wrote the tale," he said. "I worked in the garden." Even though she was only 23, she had frown lines, and her girl's body was long lost to children and despair. He had heard that she supported herself now on her own writings, having no money or recognition from her husband's estate. "I thought I had seen you before," she said, but there was no joy in her tone. "That was a strange summer," he said. "Yes," she glanced over her shoulder. "Sometimes I feel like I created my own vampire. It lives, even though at times I wish it would simply die." He stood in shock, not knowing how to respond. She tapped him lightly with her gloved fingers. "Oh, pay me no mind. The world is not what I thought it then, and I am no longer a girl whose illusions were being shattered, but a woman who knows more of darkness than she ever cared to see." She stepped away from him and to the cab waiting outside. Bram wanted to spend much more time with her. He too had become disillusioned, learning more than he cared to know about the violence that haunted the night. But she got into the carriage before he could call to her and didn't look out the window as the carriage drove away. "Do you believe in stories?" he asks the girl, this Clarissa with the classical name and such a familiar face. Do you believe they have the power to transform, even to save? Is that why you're going to the hero classes? You're looking for stories that save? He waves a hand. No, I'm talking about fiction. That inside its apparent untruths there are actual truths. Do you believe this? Sure, she says. Her tone humours him. Why? I look for people who have the capacity to believe in the impossible. He hasn't spoken of this in nearly 100 years. And the first step in finding those people is finding people who accept that there is truth in fiction. I don't see how that relates to heroes, she says. Ah, he says, heroes always believe in the impossible. They do? Professor Miller was saying that heroics is a matter of destiny, heredity, if I heard him right, like we have no choice. We always have a choice. The fact that Bram is sitting before her is a choice. The fact that he has had a long life is a choice. It is just not one he can make again. If you were to choose now, he says, what kind of life would you have? She gives him a wistful half smile. It wouldn't be this. What would it be? She shrugs. Something unusual, something adventurous, something heroic? Her eyes seem to light from within. Then she looks down. That's just silly. It is not, he says. I've lived it. I've lived 1,000 impossible things. She looks up at him. I had a hunch you'd be interesting, she says. You have that look. He smiles at that. He nods toward her book. Are you applying to graduate school? She puts a restless hand on top of it. I don't know. I'm hoping something else will come along. She is the first candidate, the only candidate he has come across in more than a decade of searching. He doesn't have much time left, yet it is hard for him. Even though he knows that women are strong, he is still a product of his upbringing. He doesn't want to risk her. Then he realizes why she looks familiar. She has that edge, that darkness he saw so many years ago in the young Mary Godwin, another woman who did not know what she wanted to do, a woman who taught him about the power of stories, enough so that he later sought out a writer to tell the tale of how to kill vampires so that people could become familiar with the methods. He had chosen Stoker, but all that time he had been thinking of Mary Shelley. Oh, it won't, though, will it, unless I choose? The girl is speaking, and he has to concentrate. His wandering mind, the worst part of his old age. He smiles at her. What would you say to a few months spent talking about stories? Stories of impossible things. Where would we talk? She asks, and the suspicion of her generation, the fears of perverts and murderers and all kinds of man-made horrors lurks behind her eyes. Here, he says, trying to seem as harmless as possible. I'll buy you a cup of coffee every afternoon for an hour of your time. Why me? She asks after a moment. Because, he says, you ask questions. Is that all? He shakes his head. Because you also remind me of a woman I used to admire. That seems to appease the girl. Will you tell me about her? Clarissa asks. Eventually, he says. When I'm sure you'll believe me. I'm sure I'll believe you, Clarissa says. Bram just smiles. He knows after more than 200 years the human capacity for disbelief. He shares it. He is struggling against it even now, all that training which taught him a woman could not succeed him, even though the evidence of his eyes, of his life, disputes it. So, she says, are you going to tell me a story? He wraps his hand around his coffee cup. I'm going to tell you a story about stories, he says, and how, when the right elements come together, they can change the world.
David Horowitz was reading Hero Dust by Christine Catherine Rush. The presenter was Natalie Haynes, and the story was abridged and produced by Gemma Jenkins.
Vampires are frequently portrayed as glamorous, irresistible creatures. But there is another side to them. The disadvantage of never growing old and preying on those humans you get close to is that you become very isolated. How does a vampire find love? Does it have to be with another vampire to avoid the tragedy of seeing your beloved grow old and die while you remain as perfect as the day you met? And what does it feel like never to see the light of day again? The vampire is an outsider, cut off from the world which he left through no choice of his own. He is dead, but still lives, separate from everything and everyone that he once knew. It's no wonder that our vampire heroes can often end up owing more to Camus than Stoker. Not every vampire can live in a huge castle and hire solicitors to deal with their admin and keep them company. Israbel, by Tanith Lee, starts with the idea that vampires cannot ever see what they look like, since they have no reflection. It's yet another sign of the isolation a vampire suffers. They can't even see themselves in the mirror. Indeed, it's one of the great mysteries of the undead that they always have such perfect lipstick.
Israbel ran through the streets of Paris. Israbel was 16, probably. Who could be quite sure? Her mother was long dead, her father always unknown. Somewhere behind her waited a man with his belt drawn off, like a sword to smite her with. Israbel ran. The narrow streets were mostly empty now, for night was coming. Cats, thin as strings, shot across the alleys or slunk over the roofs above. When Israbel turned a corner into the Place du Coeur, one further cat came slinking out to cross her path. This cat was not like the others. It was very big. The size, she was afterwards to believe, of a horse. It stopped. She, too, the running girl, had halted. 100 years later, when Israbel, still 16, rich, lovely, and, in her own way, dangerous, came occasionally to explain about the great cat, she would always add, its pelt was so soft and warm, so smooth and plush, like the double velvets of Venice. Like my hair, you say? Well, perhaps very like that.
She is the woman I intend to be my wife. Plinta stared a moment. He thought, your wife? And then, she looks like some sort of exquisite beetle. By then, the woman, the creature, was approaching them, slipping between the candlelit marbles of the salon. Dumier held out his hands. Good evening, my love. May I present my friend, Monsieur Plinta, the painter? She looked at Plinta. Her eyes were like a flash of blackness seen through blue smoke. Plinta, the artist, now realized why he had thought of her specifically as a beetle. Her black dress wrapped her closely, thrusting up a velvet glimpse of breasts. Her hair, which she wore partly loose, was quilled and rayed with gold. Wings. He thought, she is a vampire. Madame, he said, and bowed. Oh, but monsieur, she said, I'm not married. Not yet, agreed Dumier. He reached out and took hold of her. Come on, let's dance. As he led her away, she glanced back once and directly into Plinta's eyes. What was her name? Had Dumier not told him? The next evening, as Plinta, who had just left his bed, lay on the sofa reading the morning's journals and drinking bitter coffee, his shambling servant, Colas, showed Israbel into the studio. Plinta did not get up. Then he thought he had better. To be rude was too obvious, so he rose. But when he did that, she laughed at him. I saw last night, Monsieur Plinta, you penetrated my disguise. Today she wore very dark blue-green, with a lemon plume in her hat. She was still like a beautiful beetle, or maybe a lizard. Disguise, I didn't know you'd worn fancy dress, madame. Oh yes, always. But you saw right through to me, didn't you? As if I were naked. Plinta felt at once a vivid surge of lust. Positioned high in his own brain, he looked down at the lust tingling and flaring about in his body, and said cautiously, I don't know what you mean, madame. I'm not madame. I have only one name, Isabel. Under that name I sometimes sing and act at the opera. She too, he sensed, saw right through him. She knew what he felt, still felt. Isabel seated herself. She drew off the plumed hat and her hair fell all around her down to her waist. I want you, she said, to paint my portrait. Why do you want such a portrait? I'd like to see myself in it. And before he could quite stop himself, if he had even meant to stop himself, Plinta added, that being because a portrait is the only way you ever could see yourself. Am I correct, madame? Isabel smiled once more. It was difficult to take your gaze away from her mouth, unless you looked into her eyes, and then you could only look at those. I note you understand my predicament, monsieur. Others are fooled, of course, she remarked. It's commonly thought no one can make out a vampire in a mirror, but naturally anyone can see us reflected there, save only we ourselves. Then you have kindred? Said Plinta, between wonder and alarm. Perhaps, but I've met none of them. No, I'm quite alone. Then how did you become what you are? Plinta asked inevitably. If I tell you that, will you paint me, will you give me my mirror, Monsieur Plinta? He turned his back and walked off to the window. He gazed down at the icy, barely lit streets running towards the Seine. But talking to her was a game he seemed unable to give up playing. Why do you want to see yourself, madame? Anyone else's face can tell you how beautiful you are. Not yours, she said. Plinta lurched inside his skin. In utter silence, she had drawn physically close to him. Her narrow hand was on his shoulder. He wondered if she would sink her teeth into his neck. But he felt only her perfumed warmth, and then a coldness, and turning he saw she was once more seated far off across the studio. She did not appear at the opera very often. When she did, she always took some small cameo part, usually limited to a single appearance lasting maybe 5 minutes, during which she sang an aria by Handel, Rameau, or Voulet. She was said to have slept with some of the richer or more notorious patrons, bankers, poets, that sort. None of them had ever seemed any the worse for it. That is, none of them mysteriously died or otherwise disappeared. None of them, perhaps more to the point, metamorphosed in any way. They merely went on with their own earthbound lives long after they parted from her. Men did become infatuated, of course. Lumière took Plinta to dinner at the Café d'Orléans. He spoke mostly, solely, of Isabel. Plinta, to his own consternation, listened with interest and completely failed to be bored. He had already agreed with Isabel to paint her. There had seemed to be nothing else he could do. Plinta watched Lumière all through dinner. He seemed the same as ever, handsome, spoiled, and charming. Finally, when they were drunk enough, Plinta said to him, "Have you had her yet?" "Had her?" "The kiss that is more than a kiss." "Why, Plinta, what do you think? Aren't I irresistible? Isn't she?" "You have, then." "You prude! Do you want me to describe it?" "I'll tell you this, Plinta, she isn't like any other woman I've ever known." "Doesn't the new lover always think that?" "No, of course he doesn't. How absurd. We pretend we do, but we don't." "And do you mean to marry her?" said Plinta, as Lumière fell silent, hypnotized by absorbing thoughts of Isabel. "I might. I wouldn't mind it. Just to keep her to myself. I'd put her in a cage like a panther. She only lets me visit her at night. She's nocturnal, like most panthers. A cage? Despite himself, Plinter was shocked, mostly at Demeure's suddenly active imagination. Oh, I mean a house, man, a big, glorious house, but I'd have the only key. Do you know, he added abruptly, the strangest thing is when she looks into a mirror. I bought her one, you see, a gorgeous thing from Italy. She stood in front of it nearly half an hour. She had such a puzzled look, a sad look, as if she were searching for something she couldn't find. I wonder what. Her soul, Plinter thought. Worse than Demeure's invented cage house, a door slammed in Plinter's heart then, trapping him inside with Isabel. Isabel told Plinter at once she wished to pose for him in the nude. This, rather than excite, made cool sense to him. After all, if she wanted to see herself, she wanted to see her flesh, not her clothes. When she came out from behind the studio screen, he noted, unsurprised, her body was beautiful. Even her colours were simple, cream and black with highlights of turquoise, navy, and warmer tones, like shining metals. But her red mouth burned for him. What would it be like, not to kiss, but to be bitten by the teeth of that burning mouth? She had not yet, despite her pledge, told him the tale of how she became what he knew she was. He actually considered following her when she left the studio to see her method of predation, yet he never did. What would he do if she suddenly turned her attentions on him? Would he allow her his blood? Would he be able to prevent her? He was not afraid of Isabel. He was not in love with her, but obsessed he was. A winter dusk brought her early, while a thick sunfall bubbled behind the church like sweet apricot preserves. The painting was almost done, and he permitted her, when she asked, to see it. She stood a long while staring at it, just as Demure had described with the costly mirror. For one awful second, Plinter thought perhaps she could not see herself in the painted picture either. It was a very exact likeness.
Oh, thank God. There I am again. Oh, yes. Thank God. Do you know? Can you guess what it's like never again to see your own self? Think of me, I was so young. Gazing instead at my hands, my feet, my shadow, because my shadow I still have. Trying to remember myself from that, but myself, my face, my eyes, my mouth, forever gone. All of you could see them, all of you, all save I myself, and they were mine.
The penalty for everything else you've gained.
True. Nevertheless, I have outwitted the penalty. With the help of Plinter the painter. Do you know the oddest thing? I'd only seen myself 4 or 5 times in any case before I lost the ability to view my own reflection. In my, shall I even say, home. In the slum where I was born there were few mirrors. But once, a man gave me a piece of looking-glass. I looked and truly saw myself. And he said, "Now you do as I say, or I'll cut that face you see across with my razor." I did what he said. He still took off his belt to beat me. That was when I ran. This, Plinter, was about 107 years ago. It was in the era just before the revolution. Paris was raw and smarting, not yet seething. I didn't notice. I must only escape. So I escaped, as you see.
Then she told him.
The great cat in the Place de Cour had approached her so suddenly and so swiftly that Isabel had had no time to think or to decide once more to run away. Next second its body touched hers. The body of the cat was warm as a hearth, and its pelt was velvet soft yet prickling with electric life. The instant they were in contact, a feeling of content flooded Isabel. It was like the first time I ever tasted good brandy. Isabel remembered only this, walking very fast with the great leopard, whose neck was long and who was tall as a horse. They came eventually out onto the open spaces before the cathedral. Notre Dame, Our Lady of Paris. Far above her, demonic gargoyles craned, peering over and down at the city, their wings locked until midnight should strike in some other dimension and let them loose. But the leopard drew Isabel away down a sort of slope, and into a cavern under the street. She could not say exactly how it drew her. It was as if she had become invisibly connected to its skin. In the cavern... No, she had sometimes in later years looked for this spot by Notre Dame, never found it, nor any entrance to it, was the leopard's lair. The stone floor was dry and thick with straw. The air was warm yet clean, faintly tinged with the incense of Notre Dame. She lay down against the cat, which held her between its great, muscled forelegs, the paws resting round her without a hint of talons. It breathed into her face. Some of those I tell this story ask if the cat then ravished me, as lions can be trained to do with human women. Yet no such thing happened at all. It was as if I lay again a child in the arms of my mother, or a father who loved me tenderly. I never felt so secure, nor have I ever after. So I slept, my head on one of the huge arms. Isabel paused. This hiatus went on and on.
And then?
I woke up. It was twilight. I felt well and strong, as if I'd eaten a nourishing meal and drunk a little wine. I wasn't under the city anymore. I was on a back street, out of sight, where it must have taken me when it was done. I might have dreamed everything but for knowing I was glad it wasn't daytime, and for the sense of well-being, of vitality, neither of which have ever left me since. Even so, I started to cry. I ran about, trying to find the way back down to my beloved friend, for yes, the great cat had become my only friend and all the family I had. Of course I detected no way, not a single clue. I never saw my leopard again. Presently, instead, my own, humankind discovered me. And so I learnt my powers over them, what I could do and gain, what I had become.
But how had this cat taken your blood? How had it refashioned you?
Do you really wish to know?
Yes.
Isabel lowered her eyes of black turquoise. The pelt, the beautiful fur of it. Every fibre leached every atom of my blood away, and filled me in return with the ichor of the vampire race.
It's fur. Plinta surged up. He strode up and down the studio, rubbing circulation back into his numbed arms and hands. The moment he looked at her, she too got up. It seemed she did not tonight mean to pose for her portrait. Certainly she did not, for she said then, "Monsieur, your picture of me is all I could ever hope for. Now I shall pay you." "It isn't finished," Plinta exclaimed. He himself heard the panic in his tone. It was not only the unfinished painting that troubled him. It seemed their commerce, hers and his, was at an end. But Isabel only nodded gravely. "Not quite finished, I agree. But that's as it should be, as it must be, don't you think? For neither am I, monsieur, finished. Nor perhaps can I ever be. The picture has reached the very stage I myself am at. Like me, it must remain there, or how can I see myself in it?" Plinta stared at Isabel, memorizing her grace, elegance, and otherness. "And so," she said gently, "let me settle my account with you. I don't know what this picture can be worth. You know that I'm rich. Don't pay me in money." "Then how?" As she questioned him like that, Plinta saw in her a total, fatal innocence. It had nothing to do with naivety or foolishness. I must never lose her. Aloud, he said, "Show me." "Ah, show me how you feed yourself." The crudeness of the words he had used and his desire to find out both appalled him. She answered, "If you wish. But I'm hungry, Monsieur Plinta the painter. If it's to be you." "Me? Who else?" "Then I shan't hold back. You must become as I am. Do you want such a thing?" Plinta thought about it, but he had been thinking of it constantly behind a screen of debate, arguing with himself that in fact it was not possible, but it was. "Madame Isabel, I have so much to learn of my trade. That alone would need immortality. I'd like the time. I don't subscribe to the idea that being always myself I must become less. I think one must be able to evolve, even in the same continuing body. But more than that, I want to know." Isabel turned her head, as if she listened obediently to some angel at her right shoulder, who now told her what she must do. It seemed she knew the angel of old. Its advice was always sound. She touched the bodice of her dress, and the yellow silk parted and dropped, like a veil, and all else with it. As before, she stood in front of him naked. She came to him, as her kind did, as the great cat had come to her, sudden and swift. And as she came, her hair lifted up on her head in two wide black flaming wings, and as it fastened on him, and her flesh met his own clothed body, he felt the touch of her hair, skin, her eyes, her lips. Of not like mother or father, this was like the meeting of mortal man with God. Plinta seemed to lie that night, high up on the roofs of the cathedral, among the army of gargoyles which, as a white moon rose, flew back and forth, scratching their claws on the parapets. Here, Isabel took his blood, not biting, but through her skin and hair. He understood that, in the future, he too must also take sustenance in this way. Near dawn, she closed his eyes with her lips, a kind of kiss. "Sleep now. Be at peace. Asleep, the sun can't harm you. Tomorrow night, you will be changed. Then tomorrow, where shall I meet you?" he said. But Plinta discovered he could not open his eyes, and she did not reply. Asleep, he saw Isabel after all, her face framed now by the velvet and silk curtains of a stage. Wings flew out from her skull. Her face had no features at all. It was a faceless face. Colas found him the next evening. Plinta lay stiff and marble cold, splashed by the dregs of a sunset. Colas gave a yowl like a wolf. He rolled Plinta about the floor, and when neighbours rushed up the stairs, wailed that Plinta had died, and now Colas would be slung out on the streets, Colas's only actual concern. "No, you dolt. Look, he's waking up." "Dead? Plinta?" "Only drunk." Plinta woke. He stretched, and Colas, who genuinely had seen him minutes before dead as the deadest corpse, backed away, gibbering. But Plinta himself felt wonderful, like a prince who is in love and has, besides, dined on a banquet. He threw a boot at Colas, and Colas, at last reassured his patron was the same as ever, tramped off to fetch the coffee. Already the marvellous dream of the cathedral, the gargoyles, the vampire was fading. Of the dream within the dream, did anything remain? Maybe not. But Plinta soon noticed Isabel had taken her portrait away with her. Why not when she had bought it, and at an excellent price? One last splinter of dream memory did linger, however. He had asked her where he should meet her. Isabel, his sister now, in blood. But he had been stupid to ask, for Plinta had not needed to. Tonight, as much of Paris knew, Isabelle was due to act and sing her glimmering 5 minutes at the opera. Would she be glad, at last, of his company? They were brethren, and she had admitted she had discovered no kindred. 2 moods possessed Plinta as he walked the glacial streets of Paris. One was an elation not unmixed with eager fear. The other was a deep melancholy, a sort of shadow. The first state he comprehended. The second puzzled him. Was he in mourning, then, for his human life now ended? What did that matter? Nothing. Not at all. But no, it was not that. He stood in the light-spiked dark and thought, perhaps immortality is only formed for us from those countless days we may never now experience. A life of nights, doubled. All things are paid for. Even Isabelle had paid for the painting he had made of her. Plinta took a box at the theatre, a rare extravagance. He soon glimpsed Dumier across the auditorium in a box of his own with other friends. Dumier saluted Plinta, pleased to see him at a distance. But how jealous Dumier would be if only he knew. Where shall I feed? Plinta thought, as the curtain rose on some spectacular unimportance. She will show me. She will be my teacher. Then he sat back, watching the acts of the play through half-closed eyes, and all about the theatre rustled and murmured, whistled and called, alienly alive. He had never felt a part of them, the human race, and now was not. Isabelle came out in the 5th act. Plinta sat forward. His eyes widened. His heart, or some more profound mechanism, slammed high into his chest, then leapt away down into a chasm. If he had been able in those minutes, like the biblical Samson, he would have risen, grabbed vast pillars of the opera temple, and brought it crashing down. Samson had lost all. Plinta, too, had lost. Now he could never know. He who must learn everything, whether or not he had loved her. Instead, he would be like the rest of his kind, bereft and quite unique. On the stage, Isabelle sang, and the audience hung in wild suspense until the last note, then bellowed its applause and flung its flowers. But Plinta stayed where he was, still as when Colas had found him and thought him rightly dead. For she had warned him. Had she not? Certainly his inner dream of facelessness. No vampire could see itself in reflection. Only human things could see it there. But that was not only in mirrors. No vampire could see any vampire, themselves or another, either in a mirror or anywhere in the whole crystal globe of the heartless, lonely, reflective world. On the stage, Isabelle was taking her bow. Plinta alone did not applaud. To him, she was now entirely inaudible and invisible, just as he was now entirely inaudible and invisible to Isabelle, and to all their kind.
Mark Bonner and Claire Harry were reading Isabelle by Tanith Lee. The presenter was Natalie Haynes, and the story was abridged and produced by Gemma Jenkins.
The vampire may have terrorised previous generations, but for us, they have become our monster of choice. When we find ourselves in peril, a friendly vampire is exactly who we turn to save the day. Whether it's Angel, the Los Angeles private detective, or Bill Compton, Sookie Stackhouse's knight in shining armour, vampires are the ideal action heroes. And why wouldn't they be? They're quick, strong, and very hard to kill. They have animal senses that makes it easy for them to track their prey. And when they catch up with their target, they fight like creatures possessed. Because they are. Perhaps it's because vampires are night walkers. Any creature which only moves around after dark is crying out to be given a noir storyline. Or perhaps it's because they are intrinsically demonic that they have a natural understanding of the seedy underworld. But the vampire who uses its superpowers to protect a human is always taking a risk, that its enemies will realise that it has a weakness. Creatures of the night are safest when no one knows what they really are, or who they truly love. In Quid Pro Quo, Tanya Huff offers a neat gender switch on the vampire-human love affair. Her vampire is in a relationship with a Canadian policeman.
That first dose will keep him out for 4 or 5 hours, and I can safely give him 2, maybe 3 more without ill effects. Setting the syringe aside, he pulled a key ring from the discarded jacket and passed it back without turning. Search the house. If you find her, restrain her, and bring her directly here. Restrain her, boss? I suggest you use a generous amount of duct tape. There were people in the house. 2 of them. Given that their years together had taught her all the rhythms of his life, Vicky could say with confidence that neither of the hearts currently pounding out barely contained fear about 2.5 meters above her head belonged to Metropolitan Toronto Police Detective Mike Salucci, which was interesting, because the house did. As she slid out the end of the packing crate, an alarm went off, freezing her in place. Watch alarm, probably. Shit! Sunset! They were speaking quietly. High emotion but low volume. Not that it mattered. So what? She's not in here. You 100% positive about that, Steve? You sure she's not tucked in between the floors or behind a false wall? Whoever he wasn't stupid, Vicky acknowledged as she lifted the section of the false wall away and moved out into the crawl space. This was unfortunate because he headed towards the door as he spoke, his footsteps and Steve's beating a fast tattoo against the floor. Fast enough to survive? Good question. The crawl space slowed her a little. At just under 1 meter high, it had been chosen for safety, not speed of exit. Out into the laundry room, up the stairs as the door closed, across the kitchen in time to see Steve and the smart guy throw themselves into the car they'd parked in the driveway. Vicky had bet the smart guy wasn't planning on letting Steve drive, and was therefore not the short, bearded white man, but the taller, clean-shaven black man sliding behind the wheel. She'd have been inclined to say they didn't look like criminals, except she'd been a cop long enough, back before it had come down to change or die, to know criminals didn't actually have a look. She could have caught them before they got the engine started. A closed car door would have meant squat to her, but the whole sleeping naked thing made her hesitate. February in and of itself didn't mean a lot, but she could hear Peter Yuan and his sister arguing as they headed up the driveway of the house next door, and flashing the neighbors' teenagers would definitely cause trouble for Mike. As the black Jetta sped away, she considered the few inarguable facts she had. Not only did Smart Guy and Steve have a pretty damned good idea of what she was, but also thought they knew where she spent the day, and were willing to break into a police officer's house in order to do something about it. The edge of the counter cracked under her grip. Just what I need, she growled, heading back to the crate for her phone. A pair of freaking 21st century Van Helsings. Like my life isn't complicated enough. Of the 2 halves of her life, maintaining some semblance of a normal relationship with Detective Mike Salucci seemed to be giving her the most problems. It required careful socializing with people who'd known them before she'd changed, and a safety net of lies complex enough to give the most jaded politician pause. The creature of the night thing, that she had down. Never Growing Old had lost a little of its shine as she watched Mike's hair gray and the lines around his eyes deepen, but, basically, being stronger and faster, being able to deal with the human and not quite human things that haunted the nights of a big city seemed a fair trade for being helpless between sunrise and sunset. Or had been a fair trade. Until today. Still naked, she headed back upstairs, listening to Mike's phone go straight to voicemail. Theoretically, he finished at 3, and by 5:47 p.m. shouldn't be doing anything that would keep him from answering. "We have a situation." A situation. Their personal code for someone knows. "Call me as soon as you can. Oh, and I'm heading into the office, so you can meet me there." She couldn't stay at the house. Not and think clearly. Pausing by the notepad on the fridge, she scrawled down the 4 numbers on the license plate that she remembered. AAK blank dash blank blank 2, then went into the bedroom to dress. "Definitely knew what they were doing," she snarled, yanking on a pair of jeans. She repeated the sentiment a few minutes later as she slammed the kitchen door behind her and locked it. They'd taken the time not only to pick the lock on the door, but also the lock holding the chain, rather than take a pair of bolt cutters to it. The cold and the pungent hand lotion used by whichever one of them had actually handled the door made it difficult to get any kind of a scent, and they'd both obviously been wearing gloves while they were in the house. Winter clothes blocked most of the fierce sweat. Scent would have allowed her to pick them out of a crowd regardless of how good a look she'd got at them. As it was, she might recognize their voices, but that was damned little to go on. Still, she'd found other men with less. "Picked the wrong damn vampire to stake this time," she growled, forcing herself to relax her grip on the steering wheel before she broke it. Again. Winter driving in Toronto was never fun. Winter driving at rush hour, Downsview to her office on King Street East, barely maintaining a grip on her temper, was less fun by an order of magnitude. As the door to her office closed behind her, Vicky exhaled what felt like the first actual breath she'd taken since sunset and admitted that just maybe the break-in, not to mention the possibility of true death that came with it, had left her a little tense. Any lock could be picked, but the 2 heavy steel bolts and the 2x4 slid through steel brackets that secured the office door required an entirely different skill set. And tools. And would likely attract unwanted attention from the other tenants in the building. She was safer here in the day than she was at Mike's. She'd given up that safety for Mike. But then Mike had given up normal for her, so if someone somewhere was keeping score, the game was tied as far as Vicky was concerned. "By sunrise," she muttered, crossing the room to her desk, "I'd like that to be completely irrelevant." Find the car. Find out who owned it. Neutralize the threat. A few months ago, she'd had dinner with a man who designed databases for the Ministry of Transport. He didn't know it, but after she'd fed, he'd built her a back door into the system and set up the search protocols that allowed her to make the best use of it. With the day denied her, it was nothing more than a way of evening the odds. Model and license information had just been entered when her office phone rang. The caller ID showed Mike's cell number. Speak of the devil. "Hey, in case you didn't get my message, we have a situation." "You have more than that, Miss Nelson. You have one chance to save Detective Salucci's life." She didn't recognize the voice. Or her own when she answered, but then her lips were pulled so far back off her teeth that was hardly surprising. "You're a dead man." "One chance," he repeated. "My people will meet you in front of your building and bring you to me." It didn't seem like she had much of a choice. "When?" "As soon as you can get out there. Leave your cell phone behind." He'd hung up without waiting for a response, but she called him a few choice names anyhow as she shrugged back into her coat and pulled her phone out of her pocket. The Black Jetta. Big surprise. Smart Guy was still driving. Steve sat in the back and held up a phone as she closed the door. "Boss can hear every word. Try anything and the cop dies." Vicky twisted around and smiled at him, giving the hunger free rein. They thought they knew what she was. They weren't even close. There was a sudden sharp smell of urine, and Steve whimpered. "Stop terrifying my people, Miss Nelson. I can see you, I can hear you, and only your full cooperation will keep Detective Salucci alive. If you kill him..." The small webcam had been mounted on the rearview mirror. She turned to stare directly into it. "I will make you scream." "I don't doubt it. I am, however, banking on the fact that you will do nothing to endanger Detective Salucci's life. Your phone?" "In the office." "Excellent. You're going to take my word for it?" "If I find out you've been lying, you won't be the one to suffer for it. Put the blindfold on. You'll find it on the seat beside you." She found it on the seat between her and Smart Guy. Smart Guy hadn't looked at her once, his eyes locked on the road. At the speed they were traveling along the snow-covered city streets, she could kill him and take control of the car without endangering anyone else on the road. From the trickle of sweat running down his temple, it seemed he knew that. "Miss Nelson?" The threat was implicit in the question. "Fine, I'm putting it on." "Good. Now, since your hearing is undoubtedly good enough to pick up environmental sounds that may give my position away, Daniel, if you would." Smart Guy had a name. Vicky felt the air currents in the car shift, heard the click of a switch, the whir of a CD, and the dulcet tones of Celine Dion at a decibel level that had to be causing as much pain to the other occupants of the car as it was to her. Unless, of course, her 21st Century Van Helsing had recruited his minions from gaymentrappedinthe90s.com. "Couldn't you just distract me by telling me your evil plan?" she muttered, hands up over her ears. "Whatever he's paying you guys, it isn't enough." Celine slid into My Heart Will Go On. Vicky sang along. No reason they shouldn't start suffering now. 14.5 songs later, they turned onto what felt like unplowed ruts. Before the 15th song finished, Daniel turned the car off and Celine fell silent. All three of them breathed a simultaneous sigh of relief. "Stay in the car, Miss Nelson, until Daniel comes around and opens your door." By having Daniel do it, both minions were on the same side of the car as she was. Easier for one to react if she killed the other. Van Helsing was wasting his redundancies since no one was dying until Mike was safe. She stretched as Daniel closed the door behind her. "Turn to your right, Miss Nelson." Vicky turned. "Now walk 20 paces. 4 paces took her through a doorway and inside an unheated building. Approximately 2 meters behind her on the left, Daniel matched his pace to hers, while on the right, Steve's boots thumped out an arrhythmic beat, the echoes defining a large, empty space. The air reeked of cloves, but 16 paces in, she caught a whiff of a familiar scent under the spice. Mike. He wasn't bleeding. There weren't enough spices in the city to cover that. At 20 paces she stopped. 2 heartbeats in front of her, 4, maybe 5 meters away. Mike sounded drugged, his heartbeat slow but steady. "You may take off the blindfold, Miss Nelson." The boss sounded as calm up close and personal as he had over the phone. The calm before the storm. Vicky stuffed the blindfold in her pocket and slowly opened her eyes, her vision sensitive enough that even the low light in the empty warehouse was enough to cause painful starbursts. When she blinked them away, the first thing she saw was Mike. Arms, legs, and chest duct-taped to a wheelchair, his eyes closed, his mouth slightly open, a glistening line of drool running down his chin. Her would-be Van Helsing stood slightly to the left of the wheelchair, holding a gun to Mike's head. He wasn't particularly tall, with brown hair and brown eyes, expensively dressed, and vaguely attractive in a "I'm confident enough to kidnap a decorated police officer in order to get the drop on a vampire" sort of way. She kept a tight grip on the hunger. As much as she wanted to let it loose, allowing herself to give in to bloodlust would very likely add Mike to the body count, and that was the one thing she wanted to avoid. "We meet at last, Miss Nelson." His words created a vapor cloud. Hers didn't. "You do know that it's entirely possible I could kill you before you could pull the trigger?" "I know." He seemed impressed. "Which is why my men are also armed. If you begin to move toward me, they will shoot. They couldn't hit me. They won't be aiming at you." He was studying her like she was the answer to the only riddle he'd never been able to solve. "You don't want to kill me?" His brows rose. "I beg your pardon?" He knew what she was. He suspected she lived with Mike. Knew about the connection between them, at least. He took Mike because Mike's life was the only thing that would allow him to control her. And if he wanted to control her... "What is it that only I can do for you?" He smiled then. "Make me like you." Vicky blinked. "Like me?" "Yes." "You have no idea what I am." "Faster, stronger, immortal, Nightwalker, vampire." He gestured with his free hand. "A piece of evidence here, a rumor there, a camera you weren't aware of. Oh, don't worry, it's all been taken care of." "If you think this is a worried expression, you're more delusional than I thought." "Fine. Don't feel you need to start ripping throats out to cover your tracks. It's all been taken care of. The point is, I don't want anyone else to put the pieces together. I assigned Daniel and Stephen to you exclusively, and I did what research was necessary myself. The only thing I haven't discovered is why. Why? Why you would take the risks involved in tying yourself to a mortal life." She couldn't stop her lips from lifting off her teeth. "There's a lot of backstory." "I'm sure there must be. And it's not really important here and now. The point is, I know exactly what you are, Miss Nelson, and in return for the detective's life, you will give that gift to me." "Okay, let's leave your ideas about me for a minute. Who the hell are you?" "You don't know?" "My name is Damon Shea, and I am the CEO and majority stockholder of Shea Pharmaceuticals, a multinational multi-million-dollar corporation run by a man too ambitious not to cut corners and too smart to get caught." A dimple flashed in one cheek. "See, you do know me." "And you want to become a vampire?" "Think of what I could accomplish." Vicky snorted. "Yeah, I am. You kidnapped a police officer, drugged him, and are holding him at gunpoint. Strangely enough, that doesn't say using immortality to work for the greater good. But that could just be me." "Needs must, Miss Nelson." Shea shrugged. "As long as you cooperate, Detective Salucci will wake up with nothing worse than a dry mouth and a temporary craving for carbohydrates." "And you'll release him when I agree to change you?" "I will." She sighed. "The change isn't instantaneous." "I said I did my research, Miss Nelson. While I am changing, Daniel and Stephen will keep an eye on your detective as an insurance policy. You'll have left him a note explaining enough to keep him from searching for you. After the change, you won't be able to kill me because of the blood bond. Neither will I be able to kill you. You'll be free to go, and I will then change Daniel and Stephen as payment for services rendered." She wondered if Daniel and Stephen actually believed that. Didn't matter. "So," he continued, "here's what's going to happen. You are going to sign the note I've already written. You will allow me to secure you. Daniel and Stephen will take the detective home, and we will get started. There is no way out of this, Miss Nelson. I've covered every contingency. The bang of a fist against the warehouse door was so loud and unexpected the shouting wasn't entirely required. "Open up! This is the police!" One of them, she expected was probably Daniel, kept his head and pulled the trigger as she began to move. The round caught her just under her left shoulder, and the pain broke the last of the hunger free. Her hand around Shay's hand and the gun, she crushed the bones against the metal. He screamed. He smelled like terror now. Vicky smiled. Time to leave. Flicking the bloody remains of Shay's trigger finger out of the way, she turned just far enough to put a bullet into both Daniel and Stephen's heads, then threw the moaning man up over her good shoulder and ran for the other end of the warehouse. She could have broken the door down, but she shot the lock off and shoved it open carefully enough to keep from ripping it off the hinges. Scuffing her feet through the snow to keep from leaving a clear impression, rage keeping her moving at nearly full speed in spite of the wound and the struggling man, she stopped by a set of tire tracks, then made an impossible jump across them to a bit of bare rock, looked down, smiled again, and dropped down into the ravine. When she figured she was far enough from the warehouse to delay discovery, she tossed Damon Shay down into the snow. He stared up at her, eyes wide and shocky. "You called the police?" "Yeah, before I left my phone in the office." One of the benefits of fighting to maintain some semblance of a life with Mike was that she still had friends on the force. She'd reported the threatening phone call and passed on the information about the car she'd seen lurking around the house. "Research? That whole vampires are lone predators thing? That we never share our territory? That we're top of the food chain? That we walk alone? You researched vampires, Mr. Shay." Crouching in the snow beside him, she gave his shoulder a friendly pat. "You didn't research me. And you know what you also missed considering? People in the process of breaking the law tend to overreact when the police show up." The banging on the door had caused one of the minions to panic, shooting the boss, who shot them both and ran for it. There were likely drops of her blood in the warehouse as well as Shay's, but given the way budget cuts had created a massive backlog in the labs, and given that the scene was pretty self-explanatory, the odds were good they'd never run the tests. She thought about explaining all that to Shay, but the scent of his blood, steaming a little in the cold, loosened the last of her self-control. "They lost Shay's tray for a while, but they found his body later, down in the ravine. Bastard slipped, cracked his head on a rock, and between that and the blood loss, well, it was -27 when they found him, and there wasn't much left. A pack of feral dogs, or maybe coyotes, had torn the body apart. But they found his weapon. 3 shots fired, 2 into his men, and 1 into the lock on the rear door. Running ballistics is just a formality, really." "Thank you, Constable." Eyes silvered, Vicky held his gaze with hers. He shivered as her voice whispered across his skin. "Do you—" "Shh." She laid her finger against the swell of his lower lip. "I wasn't here, and you didn't tell me any of this." When he nodded, she slipped past him and into Mike's hospital room. He looked completely wiped, but he opened his eyes when she took his hand, obviously having been waiting for her to show up. After a moment, he closed his fingers around hers and squeezed. "What time is it?" 5:50. "You're cutting it close." She stayed to make sure that the police who found Damon Shay's body found what she wanted them to find. "I've got time." "You gotta love a February night." Mike's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No, I don't, actually." "Well, maybe not this February night." "Vicky." He paused and searched her face. Hospital rooms were never entirely dark, and she had no idea how much he could see. He often saw more than she wanted him to. Finally, he sighed, yawned, and said, "I've been lying here trying to figure out why Damon Shea, of all people, would grab me. I mean, there's a lot of lowlifes out there who might want to get their own back, but Shea? It doesn't make sense." He met her gaze then, one of the very few who still could, and said, "You have blood on your sleeve." That was impossible. She changed her. When Mike's brows rose, she sighed. "That's what I thought." And she was just as glad he didn't say exactly what he thought, given the blood that wasn't on her sleeve. "Shea was using me to get to you." "It didn't work." This time, but I'm a danger to you." "Given that you were the one grabbed and drugged," it seemed reasonable to skip telling him about the gun to his head, "I'd say I was a danger to you." "So," he dragged her hand over onto his chest, "what are we going to do about it?" She supposed she'd always known it would come to this. It wouldn't be easy finding another territory, but she'd have to get out of the city entirely to put enough distance between them. To her surprise, he laughed before she could say anything. "You've always thought too loud, Vic. And you've always been my weakness, from the moment I first met you, same way that I've been yours. And we've always lived the kind of life where people could use that against us. So, we'll do what we've always done." His heart beat slow and steady under her hand. "We'll watch each other's backs." "We'll watch each other's backs," he repeated. With that settled, his eyes started drifting closed. Vicky glanced over at the clock. If she stayed another 20 minutes, she'd still have time to get to her office before sunrise. As she watched him sleep, she realized that Shea had entirely missed the point. Mike was her weakness, but he was also her strength. He kept her human. And should she ever be threatened the way he'd been tonight, he'd kill to keep her safe. She just prayed he never had to.
Genevieve Adam was reading Quid Pro Quo by Tanya Huff. The presenter was Natalie Haynes, and the story was abridged and produced by Gemma Jenkins.